Hey everyone, welcome to the Troy Christian High School Chapel Podcast. At the end of this episode, please take a moment to subscribe to our Chapel YouTube channel and follow our Chapel Instagram account. Those two places will be the easiest way to check out what's coming up, as well as find some bonus content from our speakers and worship team. Most importantly, I hope the following message challenges and encourages you to grow in your relationship with God as you learn to love God and love others better. Enjoy. Welcome to this week's podcast. We're getting ready to go into a series. I've got Tommy Royce here with me. We're getting ready to go into a series in Chapel called Focus. And it's working through this whole process of how do we maintain our focus on what's ahead of us, our focus on Christ as we move forward, even in a world of distractions and things that may pull us away. Tommy, I led devotions this morning.
All right.
And in the devotions, one of the things that I'm like working through is this idea of like, at what point do you quit when things get difficult or hard? At what point do you quit? Right? So there's a couple things for me. One, I love trying new things. I love pushing myself with some things, but I don't give up easy just because something gets hard. I give up because it gets boring. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like that for me, a lot of times is the point at which, generally speaking, that I'm bouncing out of this, whatever. So I'm curious, as I was thinking about this, I'm curious, when does Tommy Royce to hang up the towel? Like when's he done?
Well, Scott, we're two very different people with this. Because
right.
As you are kind of a jack of all trades, I am like a master of none, or maybe one or two things. I have like my one or two things that I think I'm like decent at.
Okay, so real truth, what are they? What are the two things?
Like writing and talking.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree with that. No doubt. The man brings a word. When he brings a word, so check this out. Like a couple weeks in Chapel, you were just like at the very end closing out, and you just threw out this line at the end when we were like closing up worship, and the line was, this is just off the cuff, but it like hit. I mean, it hit me hard. I was like in the back like, woo, are you kidding me? But the line was like, if you can't give them a song, how are you going to give them your life? And I was like, oh, get out. Like this is the Tommy Royce just like throwing it out there. So I'd agree. So, okay. So you're like the master of like one or two. When do you like hang up the towel?
So usually I hang up the towel stays hung up before,
Okay.
But then there are things that I'm not a master of that, you just got to do. I'm a young adult, newlywed. And so I'm no longer just like the bachelor in the house who can just let things go unfixed for months and just be cool with it. And I'm not the handiest guy in the world, but I can, I'll watch a YouTube video here and there and try to fix, whatever I need to fix or install something in the house, whatever thing we just bought. And I would say instead of hanging up the towel, I do occasionally need I'm hitting pause on this project.
Oh, okay.
Because let's say I'm working on, we just got something, something to hang up or install in the house, and I'm on the struggle bus trying to get this thing to work. I'm looking up instructions, I'm looking up videos, and it's just not going the way that I think it is. Eventually I reach like a point of frustration where the more I work at it, the just worse it's going to end up getting.
Yeah.
And that's when I say, you know what, I'm going to hit pause on this for the day, get a good night's sleep, have a normal day tomorrow, and hit it up the next day. And usually it goes much better the next day.
Okay.
So
what changes though? Because if I'm assuming in your sleep, you're not like gaining some prophetic word about like what you need to do with this. So like how is just like hitting pause making that better?
Well, I've not analyzed this before, so I'm just kind of thinking through it right now. I think it's just a kind of like, it's a new day, new kind of state of mind, that kind of thought of like, I think what it is that I get over the frustration and then I reattack the problem with the frustration like on a much lower level. Like once I pick up the where I left off, I don't like automatically enter in and as frustrated as I was when it wasn't working yesterday. And so I've just got a little more clarity of mind, a little more, a little less emotional investment in how well this project goes at the beginning of that day. And so
when that frustration sets in, it's like you can't think straight.
Yeah.
Now, do you hit pause? Are you kind of like you're thinking through the process, or are you like actively working at it and then you get frustrated and stop? Like what's typical in those situations?
Well, usually I'm actively working at it and actively getting more frustrated that it's not working. And then if I don't realize it, usually my wife will say, you need to just put the screwdriver down for the day or whatever it is. And we'll reattack it tomorrow. And that usually works for us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I in devotions talked about like learning guitar because generally speaking, what happens for me is I'll stick to it until the point I get bored, or not necessarily bored, but like I've just gotten to the point where like okay, I have this enough that I can kind of like mess around with it, and then I kind of move on to the next thing. Like there's something else that's always like, ooh, what if I tried that, right? So that's generally speaking, but like there've been a couple things. Guitar was one of those. Like learning to play guitar was one of those things for me, where I think for me what it was is I was watching everybody else around me just like be awesome at it, and I'm not recognizing that they've spent years trying to learn it and get better, and I'm like, why aren't I getting this in 5 days? And so I would be like quick to be like, man, this is painful and it's awkward, and I'm just not good at it, so I just would keep giving up multiple times. Even in college I did the same thing. And it wasn't until like I had this end goal in mind, like when I actually saw like, okay, this is why I want to learn guitar. Before it was just like, oh, that sounds kind of cool, which is like most things I jump into. but when I started working with students in a worship team and things like that, it was like, oh, if I learned guitar, this would give me an opportunity to lead and fill in the gaps and collaborate with them in ways I couldn't do if I didn't have an instrument. And that end goal, that like, okay, this picture of clarity gave me the gumption, I guess, to say to kind of stick with it. But the reason why I kind of bring this up as we're thinking about focus is this idea. When we are trying to learn to follow Christ and like live this like Christian life out, there are a lot of things in it that are going to be stumbling blocks and hurdles and like trip hazards, if you will, in that process. And I feel like I don't think people quit. I think honestly, like you said, I think a lot of people just kind of get to a place where they just start to hit pause on like growth and learning to be more like Christ. And I'm curious if like people ever evaluate when that happens, Like I think there's clearly some times in life where like you've messed up, people say like backsliding, whatever. But I think the majority of people who are trying to follow Christ just hit a point where like, I've kind of got this down. And I think at that point it's where, like me with a lot of things that I'm trying to learn to do, I just get distracted by, there's other things I can be pursuing and learning and growing in. And yet, as long as I've been trying to follow Christ, I'm like, I don't feel like I'm even close. You know what I mean? Like, as much as I've tried to learn and grow, I just don't feel like I'm even close to it. And so, if you think about in your faith, where are the places where you maybe think that you lose focus, or you maybe kind of get distracted the most when it comes to like learning to follow Jesus?
Well, I think I don't have like a specific area that comes to mind, but it's more of the end goal that I get tempted to lose focus of. And it's that end goal that also, when it is my primary focus, that it becomes the thing that keeps me on track as effectively. So kind of like what you were saying, like it's the end goal of wanting to help serve through playing guitar is what keeps you on track on learning guitar. For me, it's the end goal of Christ likeness that keeps me on track on trying to stay Christ-like in all the different areas of my life. And one question I'd like to ask students occasionally in class is, what kind of old person do you want to become? What kind of old person do you want to become? Because I am of the belief that you don't become a certain kind of person on accident.
That's right.
That you end up in a destination because of all the choices and decisions you made along the way. And if your decision making is short-sighted and is not rooted in the context of answering the question, what kind of old person do I want to become?
Yeah.
Then you're going to become something short of a Christ-like, faithful, dependable person. And it will feel like it happened on accident because your decision making was in the short-sighted context.
Yeah.
And so, like, I like to, when I think about old people, I don't like to.
Do you do this often?
I do.
Do you think
actually.
of old people often?
I do. I am of the thinking that, like, the older you get, the further you are into your prime. Like a lot of people say, my prime was in my 20s, or my prime was, this or that. I'm of the belief that the longer you're around, the more wisdom you accumulate, the longer that friendship with Jesus has been going on, the more things you've been through, the more Christ-like you've become if you've stayed on that path. And so I'm of that thinking. So what I do think about old people a lot, as you just asked, and I've noticed kind of, I feel like if I were to generalize, which I recommend typically not generalizing, but for the sake of this illustration, I'm going to generalize. Right. There's two kinds of old people. There are the old people who get better over time, and there are the old people who get bitter over time, right? Like, I feel like every older person I know is either the sweetest, kindest, most welcoming, most gracious person I've ever met, or they're yelling at me to get off their lawn. And there's just this, rage about them that exists internally. And I think the reason for that is, like, I think we take a step in one of those two directions, better or bitter, every single day. Every single decision even can push us in one way or the other. And I think this circles back to the idea of, in the same way that your end goal with learning guitar is, I want to become proficient at this so that I can help lead others. My thought is, I want to be the most Christ-like, older version of me possible. And so my decision making today, I want to be the accumulation of tiny steps and decisions that lead to that end goal of, what do I need to do today to become the most Christ-like, older version of myself in the future. And so that's, for me, when I hear that we're doing the series Focus, that's one way it has applied to me a lot, is I stay focused on what is the end result I want, and how do the decisions I make today lead to that end result. Yeah,
that's such a powerful question to ask, because a lot, even some of the biggest decisions that we make in our life, typically the furthest out we project that decision to affect us is like the next 5 years. You know what I mean? Like, we're not anticipating, and those are like some of the big decisions, right? That's like, where am I going to go to college? What am I going to do for my job? Even like, am I going to get married? Like, a lot of times, I know, like, in the back of our head, it's like we're thinking about us as like we've been married for 50 years kind of thing. But a lot of times it's just like, well, where are we going to live in the next 5 years kind of thing? And what's that going to look like? But man, to have that projection of like, okay, this is where it's all heading, hopefully, that we get to live a long life and get to that place. What do I look like at the end of it all? Right. Such a powerful question to be asking, and to be intentional about even asking that in some of the small things, because that's ultimately what's really driving that ship.
What I found to be helpful with having such a long-term goal as your focus of what kind of older Christ-like version of myself do I want to become is that when we do make mistakes, when we do fall short, when we do something that doesn't fit the direction we're trying to head, when your context of thinking is how is this going to affect me in the next 5 years, a significant mistake can seem catastrophic. But when your context is in, I'm thinking of how is this going to prepare me to be the best, 80-year-old version of myself. Even something that seems like a catastrophic mistake at age 15, 16, 20, 25, 30 is just a blip on the radar, because how you respond to that mistake will end up shaping and developing you way more significantly than the mistake itself.
Oh, for sure. And that perspective of how is this going to affect me in the next 5 years, viewing it catastrophically, if it's a bad mistake, would then cause a different response to that than how is this going to shape me as an 80-year-old, 90-year-old?
Right.
You're going to respond to that differently because you have that perspective. That's so good. That is so good. I thought as I was thinking through this idea of learning hard things and doing hard things and the process of when do you give up? The thing that clicked with me was the process of learning how to walk.
Yeah.
Because I think that's not something we intentionally think, or I'll say this, we don't remember the process of learning. At least I don't know anybody that can tell me about the process of them learning to walk. They were too young, right? But we do it. We all kind of go through this process. And I think one of the things that stuck out to me, there's two kind of insights that I think really have helped me in this process of thinking about learning to become more like Christ. One is, when do you give up learning to walk? Right? You don't give up learning to walk until you got into the place where you don't have to think about walking. Right. It's just become this innate process that you do in your life. And my thought with that is, man, what if I approached learning to follow Jesus that way? That I was never going to stop trying to learn, to grow, to get better at learning to follow Jesus until I got to the place where I'm just innately living like Christ has called me to live, where I'm not having to intentionally think about what would Jesus do in this situation? How would Jesus respond to this?
Yeah, I think that is spot on for what our focus needs to be. That kind of reminds me of a concept that has been brought to my attention throughout the past few years, and it's that formation is greater than information. And the idea is that we are moldable, shapeable, developing, and maturing beings. And we are not necessarily just people who we were not just given information. Okay, Jesus told us to do this. Now, no matter how screwed up you are on the inside, no matter how flawed you are on the inside, no matter how many bad habits or bad tendencies you have, you just got to do what Jesus said to do. And then we end up just trying to willpower our way towards following Jesus. When I think a more effective strategy is, how do we put ourselves in a position to be transformed by God? How do we create habits that are connecting with God? And when we have those habits where we connect with God, God shapes us and makes us more similar to Him, so that doing the things Jesus did and doing the things Jesus taught us to do become more natural to us over time. Yeah. I think about the sin issues that young people struggle with that older people don't. It's not just that they've been walking with Christ longer. It's that people grow and develop and change, and there is the idea. Or at least
that is the goal.
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Right. But there's just something about our growth and development as human beings that push us in a certain direction. And I think as Jesus followers, our mindset and our focus should be based on, how do I put myself in a position for God to shape me and change me and make me more Christ-like from the inside out, instead of just, okay, how do I willpower my way into following Jesus?
Yeah. No, that's so helpful. And I think when you view Christ, when you view God, like Paul said, God is working all things for the good of those who love him according to his will and his purpose. And his purpose, his will is helping you to become more and more like his son. So anything you face, even those like royal screw ups that could feel catastrophic when you're a young person, if your perspective and your view of God is, okay, I messed up. And I think there's a process of just owning that and dealing with that. But then if the perspective then goes to, okay, but God is going to work this for my good and for the good of those around me because he loves me. That was the other realization I had about the process of walking is I have a son, Eli, and when he was learning to walk, and all parents are this way. If you watch parents teach their kids or like help their kids learn how to walk, the moment is not those moments are not like criticism and like it's not like, oh, you're terrible, like how can't you get this after like 2 days of like stumbling around, you look like a fool, right? No parent is doing that. Like if you watch them, man, parents are like ecstatic about it, like they're smiling, and when the kid takes their first step, it's awkward and clumsy and like difficult, and yet the parents are like, yes, like they're learning they're getting it, right? And I think if is not an accident that one of the primary metaphors of us understanding who God is, the nature of God in Scripture, and particularly Jesus uses, is God as a father. And I think if we understood that concept of like, hey, if we are honestly searching and seeking to become more like Christ, even in our stumbling and tripping and awkwardness and falling in the process of learning to live like Christ, God the Father is a father who is, yes, like you're getting, like you're moving, you're taking steps. And I know this is difficult and painful, but I think our default oftentimes is God's just disappointed in us. That judgment and consequences and punishment have to happen. And yet I see as becoming a father and watching even my son continue to take some missteps here and there, and I do the same thing, right? Like it's a process. There's still this joy in that process that I think could change the way we view how God is seeing us, and as a result to give us the confidence to keep moving forward, even in the process of like losing focus and dropping the ball or misstepping and falling as we're trying to learn to become more like Christ in that.
It's 100% true. If God wanted to create us as finished products, he could have easily done that.
Yep.
If God desired for us to just always be that way, he could have created us that way. But instead, he chose to incorporate process. He chose to incorporate journey. And there must be something about process and journey and growth and development and maturity that God thoroughly enjoys, or else he wouldn't have created the world to be a place of process and growth and development and journey. And so when we recognize that, I think it gives us that freedom to develop, to be in a process, to grow, to not be perfect from day one, and to have bumps along the way and missteps along the way, because God clearly has a favor upon growth and development that it's almost like a preference over just completion and perfection. I think God values restoration and redemption more than just a clean cut perfection that was never flawed to begin with. Right. And so I think that, as you mentioned too, God's a father, and we have to remember what kind of father that God is. He is more loving than the most loving concept of love that you could ever imagine. Mm-hmm. He is more gracious than any moment of grace that has been given to any human, to another human on this planet. He is more caring and compassionate than any display of care and compassion we've ever seen. And one of the stories Jesus uses that I think helps paint us a picture of what kind of father God is like is he says, "You who are evil, who are fathers, know how to give good gifts to your children. How much more is God the Father gracious and loving to us?" And if that says like, yeah, if even us screwed up people who make mistakes, and even people who have no relationship with Jesus at all can be good parents and can give good gifts to their children, how much more so, how much infinitely more so than us is God good?
Yeah, man. These kinds of things, these kinds of thoughts and processes and perspectives are critical to us learning and continuing to learn to follow Jesus, to stick with it, to not give up in the process or not hit pause, because ultimately God, Christ, is calling us to something deeper than where we're currently at. And so I'm excited about the series coming up in Chapel, just that process of learning how to maintain our focus in the midst of all this stuff. So look forward to those coming up. And thanks for joining us in this week's podcast. See, Royce, great conversation.
Thanks.
Appreciate that today.
Yeah.
It's a good time. Have a good one.